Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I'm treated very well, I can tell you, for your later career. And on the other hand, it's a very long drive. We are in Bolzano. We always have to go over the Alps to come to the next airport. And I learned that you also, like the same time, it's 2 hours. If you don't get an airplane here, it's a 2 hours drive. So at least in this respect, the cities are very similar. It was really difficult to find out what my speech should be about. And yesterday I learned that this is part of a longer series of lectures devoted to the question of what actually is design practice. What is artistic practice? I think they're very close. And your invitation says the main issue is searching. There's a quote of a person who I did not know, Federico del Clau. You say it like this? So in Europe we still have language problems, do we? And he says artistic practice has to do with spontaneity, happiness, and personal touch. Now, this is something, I mean, we all agree on, but it's a little bit too little. It's not really enough. So how can we understand better what we do, and can we understand it at all? As we are in an architectural faculty, I want to start with architecture. This is a building Frank Gehry built in the 90s. I try to remember, I think in the 90s, in America. And it's a school of management. And you see the typical Frank Gehry style. So this is what we expect. Now, of course, when you do a building like Gehry did, you listen to the professors who should use the building. Of course, this is what every architect does. So he had this meeting, and there were 2 professors, and actually they learned a lot during the conversation with Frank Gehry and the people who helped Frank Gehry. They started to discuss the building, and of course one of the first questions was the layout of the rooms. How many space do you need? Of course, you know, professors need big offices. Then we need small lecture rooms, because this is a very noble university also, and they don't want to have so many students, and so on and so on. Now, these managers expected that when they met with Gehry 4 weeks later, they would work on the results of their last meeting. But Gehry started completely from scratch. He threw everything away, which they discussed in the first meeting, and they started again, and again, and again. And these teachers from management, they wondered, and they started to understand that there's a difference between their scientific approach and the approach of an artist like Frank Gehry. And this is, I think, our interesting issue. The difference we have between a kind of analytic way of thinking and producing knowledge, like we think all scientists do. It's not true, but we think it's like this. And the way we produce knowledge as designer or architect. And in fact, these professors from management changed the program of the school afterwards, because they said we should not educate managers any longer as people with a scientific habit. We should understand them as designers. What they do, how they produce their knowledge should be more related to a design practice. And they created something which is called management by design. It's not design management. It's a way to do management of big firms and understand yourself as a designer. Now you see here a short view on how Geary starts to work, little drawings, not really developed, and I'm closing here my introduction, and actually the question for me today is why actually is artistic practice so important? What is artistic practice? And we said spontaneity, happiness, personal touch is not enough. I will propose some other aspects of artistic and designerly practice. But we talked about it in the car. How come that suddenly managers are interested in the way designers produce knowledge? Why are teachers interested in the way designers behave? Why are managers interested in artistic practice? They're not so much interested in the artwork. They're interested in the practice which produces artworks. So this is also something very important to have in mind. At least in the development of art in the last 50 years, the work became less and less and less important and is a trigger to do a certain type of practice. I'll come back to this. Now, why is artistic practice becoming interesting in our culture? Why is this lecture called How to Do Things Without Words? Because we have a very famous book by a philosopher called John Austin, written in the 60s, How to Do Things with Words. And this was an interesting book because in former times we had the idea that you have like a program in your mind, and then when you speak, you use this program. There was a famous philosopher, language philosopher, who said, we have a competence, and whenever we speak, this is a kind of performance of our competence. Now in the 60s, the global situation of the humanities changed principally because everybody did not believe any longer into competence. Everybody asked, where is competence? You know, we won't talk about brain surgery, but nobody could find competence. And we understood in this moment that actually what we construct as competence is a way, a regular way to behave. So, a famous example of John Austin is when you do two people meet on the street and someone makes like this, you know, this is, or you say hello, then you do something with words, because what you do is greeting. But there is no competence called greeting. It's a habit you learn by and by. So there's a general shift in the 60s and 70s from the idea of something which is a universal competence to practices which can be very special. I had the privilege this morning to go to Orteza's museum, and it's very interesting how he relates something which is a kind of international style and discourse into something which is a practice, very specific to his biography and the tradition he has grown up in. So there's a big shift between an understanding of reality, pretending there are universal laws, to something where, in a way like anthropologists do, we look at behaviors here in Spain or in other countries. So there's the crisis of the transcendental, and there's a crisis of rational thinking, also because people tried hard to argue, and with very catastrophic results. I mean, we talk about Second World War, but also now there is a rationality going wrong in the moment. So we're fighting with a certain understanding of rationality. And here's the hope that another type of knowledge production might help. Of course, we live in the time of the computer, and the computer is a very strange machine. It seems to be a very logical machine, but it's not. It's an experimental machine. When you write a computer program, you cannot calculate it in advance. You have to be a craftsperson. That means you work on your program and you step by step develop it, and you see the mistakes like a ceramic person sees a mistake, and the person reacts and changes the material or the practice. And this is exactly how a programmer worked. Many people left Google because Google said you're not allowed to experiment, you have to deliver. And many of the best programmers left Google because they said, this is against my craft. I must be allowed to experiment, otherwise this is not computing, it might be something else. So we gradually come from an industrial culture into a kind of network culture, and with this change we need another understanding of knowledge and another way to understand knowledge production. You might call this the pragmatic term. 50 years ago, when you wanted to work in terms of culture, you went into the museum or into the concert hall. Today, everybody actually is already working in a cultural way. We did an education program, and I want to give you a short glimpse. And we invited students from all faculties to participate in this artistic program. And when we asked them to make a drawing, it was a disaster. They didn't even know where's the tip of the pencil. But when we asked them to make a film or a photograph, they were like highly educated filmmakers. And this is very interesting. Everybody turned gradually into a type of artist. That doesn't mean not everybody is becoming Picasso, but more and more people are acquainted to produce knowledge in an aesthetic way and not in a logical way. And this is what Joseph Beuys meant when he said every man an artist. He did not mean that everybody is potentially a Picasso, but he meant that a certain practice to work with visual things is inherent to the human condition. So there's a reason why everybody is so interested in artistic practice, in architectural practice, in designerly practice, and not by chance. I mean, we didn't have an agreement on the lecture, but apparently my interest 1,000 kilometers away fits perfectly in your interest here in Pamplona. Now, let's come to the most important part of my lecture, because how do we describe this type of practice? What's the difference between our practice as designers and architects and artists to the practice of a scientist? Let's say a bad scientist, because a good scientist, we learned meanwhile, is actually a good designer. So let's look at some of the aspects. It was very funny. Some years ago, we had a fashion called design thinking. Who has heard of design thinking? Well, okay, my colleagues. We had design thinking. And it was very fashionable, and it was the invitation that actually everybody could be a designer. You just use design thinking. And you see, they said it's a process, at least. And then there is a moment of inspiration. There is a moment where you design, and then there's a moment where you implement your design. And of course, you have to understand what you want to change. You have to observe. You have, I don't know what POV is, but then you have to ideate. So you have to develop an idea. Someone knows what POV is? Huh?
Point of view.
Point of view. Point of view. You have to take your point of view into account. You have to ideate, and this is always repeated. Now, if this would be our problem, it would have been solved 100 years ago. Apparently, this is much too simple. I want to propose some other aspects, and next week I'm in a conference in Germany, and it's about cultural aesthetic practice also. And here are some topics of the conference: hacking, strolling around. I'm not happy about strolling around, and narration. And I added assembling and the role of embodiment. So let me briefly go through these aspects of designerly practice, aesthetic practice in general. Now, what do we mean by narration? Narration actually for everybody in design has become a very, very important issue. And you see, for me, this is a field of ideas. So it's not about questioning what actually is narration, but I think that to narrate is also to stroll around, and there are also aspects of discourse, archive, and even mapping. Now, you cannot avoid, when you talk about strolling around, to talk about the situation of the late 60s in Paris, Guy Debord and his friends. And these guys, in a way, by going through the city, developed an inner film. And this is a very nice graphic. These are parts of Paris. It's a map of Paris. It's a situationist map of Paris, mapping. And you see that it's not all Paris which is interesting, but there's specific places with specific atmospheres and specific narrations. And by moving around, they call it the dérive, the moving around, the strolling around, a narration gets into existence. And of course, this can also be a narration, an assemblage of languages and images. So the putting together, the seemingly putting together by chance, implying your bodily movement, your bodily experience, seems to be a very interesting aspect of creative practice. Now, here, Mr. Federico Del Clau reminds us that we're quite lost if we don't listen to the achievements of people, artists before us, and designer before us. We have to learn from them, he says. And this is what I mean by archive. And actually this has become a key idea of aesthetic practice today. We're not any longer interested to be creative ourselves. We know that we have to apply and to use the language of others. And so culture, in a way, is a big archive, and I use the work of Christopher Williams, the famous photographer, to indicate the role of archive. He's restaging fashion photography. So he would use a mannequin, a girl who is a professional in showing fashion, and you see the whole layout in the way fashion photography is produced. You see the color stripe. The angle of the photography is a little bit distorted, but he relies very much on an established language to produce something new. And I think this is a very, very important aspect. Now, we always forget that the specific of design practice is that it's not only made in your head. Your teachers will always say, don't tell me what you want to do it, and then show it. One problem we have in Italy, I don't know how is it here, we have lots of students, the semester starts, and we have an assignment, And first week they come and they say, oh, I have a beautiful idea. I do this and this and this. And then 2 weeks later they come and they have a little scribble on a paper and they say, look, my idea developed. So they work on ideas. But designers don't work on ideas. They work on materials. They have to develop their ideas in dialogue with materials. And the same holds for artists. And the same holds for philosophers. You should not forget. The philosopher is not a guy who sits in his study, looks towards the ceiling and thinks. The philosopher is a writer. So he has to sit down in front of his computer and write the first sentence. And the experience, the sentence doesn't fit his ideas. So he has to change his ideas because of the sentence he wrote. You'll make this experience when you write your texts. The ideas come by writing, and words are material. They're not pure idea. So if you take this series out of the dialogue with material, comes designer knowledge, comes artistic knowledge. So in a way, it's a theory in practice. And a beautiful example, we talked about him this morning, is the Mexican artist Gabriel Orozco, and it's a nice image of, you know, how you can form your own heart in the dialogue with material. It's unavoidable after doing this and that and that what you did becomes a mirror of your identity, becomes a part of your identity. So the dialogue between different materials and your ideas seems to be very, very crucial. When the dean wrote to me, he did not really know what were my interests, so he wrote to me, talk a little bit about your personal experiences, which I understand is quite interesting. You have an old guy who made a lot of mistakes in his life, and you have the chance to ask him, could you please tell us about your mistakes so that I don't do your mistakes? We can all learn from your mistakes. I'm not someone to learn from. But some biographical remarks. This is where I worked 10 years as a curator, and this was one of the early works of Olafur Eliasson, who is now quite well known. Artist, architect, designer, I don't know, designer, artist. And you see, it's the fog of a discotheque and a huge light. And this was like, turned the exhibition house into a kind of steaming ship or whatever. It was a cloud, and it was very beautiful. I bring this photograph to mention that I was always interested in a practice which in itself creates theory. I was never interested in becoming a philosopher. I was never interested to be just a curator. I always tried to do curatorial work to learn. Now this is not very popular. This is why I stopped to be a curator. And in those years I was working, it was very difficult to be between two chairs. Today it's very interesting. Today the academic community is a little bit more open to interdisciplinarity. And the issue of theory and practice is now widely accepted as a topic. Yeah, these were the spaces inside. I should hurry a little bit. Yeah, my colleague says hacking is another important aspect of artistic practice. I don't like the word so much. It sounds a little bit like 90s. It has a certain subversive touch, but you don't quite know what it means. We had a time where appropriation was a very, very important artistic technique. I will show you an image, but you have to have in mind that appropriation is not only about stealing ideas from other artists. but actually it's a form of inheriting. So when Mr. Federico del Clau says we have to relate to the great invention of the elders, this is a very romantic formulation to something which is actually a very common social phenomenon. You have to integrate into an existing practice. Nobody, and this is what I always tell my students, we have these art students, first semester they come and you say, why do you want to make art? And this girl, 18 years old, sometimes this boy of 18 years says, well, I want to tell the people from my inner convictions and emotions. And we all say, why? Why should someone be interested in your inner emotions? Nobody is. I mean, you have your emotions, I have my emotions. There's no reason that I should be very much interested in your emotion. Art is not about expressing my emotion. Art is a practice of knowledge production. And this means there's always a community. We talked about the community of Oteza. He lived alone in his mountains, which is always very dangerous. Artists, when they're young, should always be part of a community. But he was not alone, because he looked at Donald Judd's work. And he knew about Malevich. So he had his community of practice. And he moved as part of this community of practice. And I think it's very important for designers also to understand which community of practice you want to be part of. Because you cannot be part of all the community. You have to decide, you have to take a position, not only because you're forced to, but especially because the practice you follow is defined through the community. You're not up to invent your own practice. Nobody is able to do it. Okay, images. Now, this is one of the famous work of the American artist Richard Prince, and you might have the feeling you know the image, and probably you do because it's a Marlboro advertisement, and he just put away Marlboro from the poster. And this is appropriation. He did not do anything, and we have other artists, Sherry Levine, who just took a photograph of an American photographer and published the same photograph under her name. This is appropriation. Now, it's not a scandal. Many people are shocked because, oh God, you know, she's stealing these ideas. She's stealing these images. No, she's just prolongating and following a practice. And by taking the photograph of a man being a woman and giving a female name, Sherry Levine, and say after Walker Evans, it is a very specific practice, and you locate this practice in a community. And then, of course, what happens with a Marlboro advertisement? Is it the same, only missing the name? No, it's a critique. And here we have another important word of the situationist, a détournement. You take something and you turn it into something. And we have a completely new understanding of innovation since some years. Innovation is not something you intend to do. Innovation is what necessarily happens when you appropriate. If you try to do the same thing again, you will fail. And in this failing, you have the gap where innovation starts. In my studio, which is a curatorial studio, we looked at the work of a not so well-known German artist, and it turned out that it is although he's not known, it was very important and expensive to get hold of the work. So we did want to do a very nice exhibition of his works. And it turned out that we should have paid 20,000 euro to simply loan the works. We're not so lucky and have a nice museum on the campus. So we just started to redo the works. We studied the works, And with sculpture, it was a kind of minimalist sculpture, so the students started to just redo the works for the exhibition. Now, are these the same works? No, never. And it's a very interesting issue to think about the difference. Even if you try to do the same work, it's not the same. And then, you know, you seduce. He uses white wood. No. Might be red would be more sexy today. So you start to play. And here's the difference. We enter a social field and we play with rules, and one of the most important or influential forms of détournement was the Unarchitecture exhibition of Gordon Matta Clark. And you see, they collected a bunch of photographs, not many, 12, 15. But you see, suddenly they said, this might be understood as the architecture of a bridge. This might be an interesting idea for a house. So by turning ideas around, they come up with a completely new understanding of architectural practice. Think of, I think it was Rem Koolhaas's doctorate thesis on the Berlin Wall. Here you have an architect who refuses, as his doctorate thesis, to deliver a new building. He's just working on an old building, but he's creating a strong architectural impulse. This is the generation of Gordon Matta Clark. I'm close to the end of my short lecture. On our list, and on many of the lists, we are missing some very, very important aspects because it's so difficult to talk about it. And Federico de Clau says, you have to have happiness. What is happiness? Most of the artists actually are not very happy. I don't know about designers, but a lot of time designers are also not very happy. And when they're happy, they're not very productive. So there's a problem with happiness. Now, there is something which has to do with désir, with a demand. You have an idea of what should come. And this idea is not something you have intellectually clear in your mind, but it's more a kind of emotional direction you have. The famous philosopher Gilles Deleuze spoke of lines of flight. So you have, there is something, there is your writing desk, and you feel the whole thing should move more to the right than to the left. Actually, and I look to my experienced colleagues, actually this is the right capacity of a professional designer or architect. And knowing his or her own language and anticipating the tendency, it could develop too. And this intuition for the tendency, which Deleuze calls the lines of flight in a field, I have even an image. This seems to be a very, very important aspect, apparently an emotional aspect and not a rational one. And it seems to be deeply inscribed into our practice. This is why we're living very much in tension to the future, while analytic thinking is very much living in tension to the past, to the axioms. So there is a tending towards a future which helps you to transform and to create something in the present. And apparently it's a kind of energetic phenomenon. Now the letter of the dean was very hesitant at the end. He says, we meander through uncharted territory. And indeed, I think it's very difficult to know exactly what artistic practice is, and might be it's part of the game that we cannot answer, but we have to do it. Just two indications. Because it's a practical issue, we started an initiative at this university. I mentioned it. And we said every student should have a training in design and practice. So we invited like 8 artists, and students had to study this program 2 times 2 days, and they could go to architecture. This is a view of architecture where they just learned to look in a precise way. But this is better from the workshop in architecture. So the architect forced them to measure their container city, but not with a meter, but with a lighter. And then transfer the measurement into a model in space. Then when you did 2 days architecture, you had to switch to another field like drawing. Now here you see the students, they're forced to have their eyes blinded and then blind do a drawing on the wall for about 40 minutes, which is a very strange experience, I can assure you. This is another exercise. And there was also a kind of yoga exercise. You see this girl in the library, and it's a very strange experience of exposing yourself, like you expose your ideas, original ideas when you are a designer or architect. Here you expose yourself, and you make a bodily experience. They were forced to build improvised buildings in the buildings of the university to meditate. So behind this construction, someone is sitting, trying to meditate. The idea really was that by the difference of different creative activities, you come to a kind of core experience which might connect to the points I just mentioned. I jump about the experience when we did this course of management by design, and as a resume I bring this. I found this in Venice on one of the poles, and I agree completely. Might be all schools should be art schools. In the moment you understand that art is about a specific way of producing knowledge. So 45 minutes. Thank you very much.